Welcome to the valve adjustment walkthrough on the XV250 motorcycle from Yamaha. This should cover all models from the 80s until the current day, Route 66, Virago 250, and V-Star 250 motorcycles. They're all pretty much the same bike, and this footage should apply to all of them. It's a bit of a tricky job. You can see I did it here in my apartment parking lot, and this is a video I'm re-editing just to make the voiceover a little cleaner and be shorter runtime and easier to follow. As long as you're careful and keep track of your nuts and bolts, you should get through this no problem. Just to start off, we're going to need your standard sort of 1/4 inch with all your sizes, 8, 10, 12, 14. Basically, if you've worked on this bike before, you know what sizes the bolts typically are. You will need an 8mm wrench for adjusting the tappets. For the crankshaft, to move the crankshaft around, you'll need an extension with a 17. This will work for me. Some pliers, good for hose clamps and also holding the tappets in place. This is what I'm going to use because I don't have a special tappet tool. If you've got one of those, you'll need one made for an 8mm lock nut. I got a brush, so we're going to brush some dirt off of the tappet covers, valve covers, before we open them up so nothing falls on the motor, and just some good screwdrivers, number 2 Phillips, and just a cheapy flathead. Here I've got a printout from a great website for working on this bike, Virago250street.com. Printed this out, and it's going to give us a good overview of our valve adjustments, what the icons mean for the crankshaft, and what we need to set the valves to. The valve covers are a 24mm cap, and what I've got here is some washers that I've sized up from the hardware store to take the caps off of your crank cover or your stator cover. Alright, good first step is just to take your seat off, and that'll let us get the bolt off the back of the tank. And we're just going to lift the tank up a good couple inches. You can take the tank off, but it just creates more work. So for the seat here, I'm going to get an extension on a 1/4 inch ratchet with a 10mm. I'm going to take off a bolt right here and another one on the other side. Once you have your seat off, you'll see this 12mm bolt that goes to your gas tank. We're just going to remove that to give us better access. We're going to lift the back of the tank up a couple of inches so that we can get to the engine a little cleaner. It's not necessary to take that gas tank all the way out. That's more trouble than it's worth. We just need that couple of inches of extra room. On the other side of the bike, you'll need to take off your airbox. There's 2 5mm hex screws. You'll see one on the bottom and then one on the left. I've already taken the bottom one off. Now I'm taking the one on the left off. In between the airbox and the frame, you'll see a little hose that's connecting the airbox to the frame. The frame actually has a little cavity that functions as part of the air intake system. You'll need to remove the hose clamp on that, or just loosen the hose clamp. So it's a number 2 Phillips screw. Just loosen that, which you can see I'm doing here, and then you'll take your flathead screwdriver and just gently remove that hose from the flange on the frame. Once that's done, you'll see there are 2 more hoses on the airbox. Just pull the clamp off, give the hoses a little bit of a rotate, and they should pull off no problem. While you're here, it's a great idea to check out your air filter. I installed a K&N filter on this bike about a year ago, and I did notice after checking it, it had fallen off just because of how it's attached in there. To get this airbox open, you see we've got all these different screws. The only ones you need to worry about is this one here and this one here. These are a number 3 Phillips, not a number 2, so you might go stripping these out if you try using a number 2 on them. Alright, so screws fell out. Keep track of those. And here at the airbox, everything looks fine. Screws loosely in place, so I'll tighten that down. I might get some Loctite on this, but our filter looks clean enough to reuse, and we'll just set this aside for now. On the left side of the bike, we'll need to remove the left side pod. This pod has a air intake recirculation system of some sort. There's a couple of valves and a filter box. To get the cover off, we'll need to remove the 2 Phillips head screws, which you can see one is on the top and one is on the bottom. That cover should just slide off. Set that aside, and you'll see the box on the left. That's the filter box. There's 2 screws again on a bracket, one on top, one on bottom. After that's removed, then you can see we have a hose on the right, and there will also be a hose on the back. The one on the right will have the hose clamps, which are easy enough to remove with your fingers. And then there's the one on the back. That should just pull off. There's no clamp on that one. Now we can remove the check valve. You can see there's a small hose on the right, which is going into your air intake plenum. And just remove that hose clamp. Give the hose a bit of a twist with your pliers to break the seal. And then you should be able to pull that hose off without too much problem. There's another hose coming out of the bottom of the check valve, and that should just pull off without any clamps. Once that's out of the way, you can now see the two 10mm screws that are holding the pod assembly on. We're just going to remove those two screws and then let the pod hang by the hoses on the right, and that should be all the room we need to do the job. Now you can see we have enough room to get to the 4 engine head covers. There should be just 2 bolts on each. Again, there's 4 covers in total. Go around the bike and remove those, and now we can get access to our valve covers. Now that our head covers are off, we'll need to get to the stator cover, and we'll remove these 2 caps here. The one in the bottom is plastic, the one on the top is metal. You're going to use washers to remove these. I wouldn't use a flathead screwdriver because that's going to mar them up really bad. They're actually a cylindrical cut in there, so the washers are going to fit in much better. You can see the one on the bottom, you need a big washer on that, and you can just take it off by hand since it's plastic, but the one on the top is going to be a bit tight. So what I'll use is a pair of vice grips, and that'll give me the leverage I need to take that cap off. Once that cap is off, you'll notice there's some O-rings. Make sure you keep track of those. If you lose them, you'll have a pretty big oil leak. We're ready to start moving this crankshaft around. There's a 17mm bolt here, so we're going to get our 17 socket, an extension on that. What's important to note is that this motor, from this perspective, rotates counterclockwise. You'll want to rotate it counterclockwise, and we're going to bring these cylinders to top dead center one at a time. What I have here on this paper that I will link to is your indication of whether you're at the front or rear cylinder top dead center. So I'm going to do the front first. That's the easiest to get to. We'll save the best for last. I'm going to put a socket on this and start rotating it over. The marks will look like that, and there will be a triangle molded into the cover that should point at those 2 marks for the front cylinders. In addition to the marks on the crankshaft, you want to make sure that your camshaft is in the right position as well. You can have the crankshaft in top dead center for whatever cylinder you're working on, but you may be in exhaust strokes. There will be pressure on that valve and you won't be able to adjust it. So there's 2 caps, one per each cylinder. On the front cylinder, which I'm about to do, the cap will be on the left. For the rear cylinder, it's on the right. And once you take that off with the 2 number 3 Phillips head screws, there's going to be an O-ring that seals it. You just wiggle that cap off and it should pull and give you access to your camshaft sprocket. On this sprocket, you can see there's a small line on the bottom which indicates that I'm on the exhaust stroke. So what I need to do is rotate the engine another entire rotation to get that mark lined up with the triangle on the top, and that's going to indicate that I'm not only at top dead center, but that I am on the compression stroke and there will be no tension on those valves. So make sure that this mark is lined up as well depending on what cylinder you're working on. One last thing we need to do before we get access to our valves is clean the caps off. You can see I just use a nylon brush and I knock that dirt off, and then I come in with a paper towel to clean up the rest of the oil. You don't want any of that stuff falling in your motor, so definitely do this before you get the caps off. It's going to be a 24mm wrench you need. Just knock those loose. They shouldn't be too terribly tight. And then you can unscrew the caps. You'll see there will be an O-ring on the bottom. Just give that a quick inspection to make sure it's not completely crushed. As you can see, we have our valve covers off, and I've also taken that sprocket cover off, and you can make sure that that timing mark is lined up with the triangle on the top, and we are on the compression stroke for this cylinder. Alright, here I've got a better look at the exhaust valve. I went ahead and read the clearances off on this sheet, and what we need to have on exhaust side is about 0.12 millimeters. On my cheapy set here, you can see I've got, well, you can't see, you'll have to trust me, 0.1 and 0.13 millimeters. I've got two sets of feeler gauges. I've got a cheap set so that I can bend them and get them into these clearances, and then I've got an expensive set that I try not to bend for adjusting valves on cars. This is an engine designed in the 80s, so the clearances are very forgiving. I'm starting by measuring what my valve is currently set at. My gauge has 0.15, 0.13 and 0.10. So I'm going to start with a 0.13 and just make sure that I could get that feeler gauge in between the valve, and you can see I do have clearance for that. Then I check at 0.1 and I have a very, very light drag on 0.1, so we know we have right about the right measurement. I then went up to a 0.15, and you can see that I was able to get the 0.15 gauge in with a pretty heavy drag, but it still means that our valve has too much clearance. Now that we know we need to do an adjustment, we'll start by loosening the 8mm nut on the tappet. That's going to let us screw the post down just slightly. We'll give it about a quarter to a half a turn, and then we'll retighten it and check our valves again. So that's what I'm using my vice grip pliers here for. You just get a good adjustment on those pliers and make sure they're not too tight, but tight enough to hold the post in place as you tighten the nut. Get that nut nice and snug, and then we can do another check. Now that we've made an adjustment, we need to recheck our clearances. You can see I have a 0.13 out, and I have a pretty heavy drag on that. I'm going to check with my 0.15, which should not fit in, and as you can see I'm having trouble getting that in, so we know our valve is just about in spec here. Don't feel bad if you have to do this too many times. It's a pretty tight tolerance, and this is honestly the last take I had to do about 2 or 3 different times before I got it in a spec that I was happy with. I'm just checking here again with my 0.1, and of course there's plenty of clearance for that. So now that everything's double checked, we can go ahead and make sure our nut is tight, and before you close it back up, it's always a good idea to do a triple check, and then you can put the valve cover back on. I've stepped over to the right side of the bike to do the intake valve on this front cylinder. You can see, zooming out, on your gas tank you're going to have your fuel pump here. There's 2 8mm bolts. Go ahead and remove those, and it'll let you pivot your fuel pump out of the way. Additionally, there is a hose. You just twist that off, same way you'd remove any hose, and then you'll finally have clearance. There's also a couple of wires that are going to be in your way, and I'll show those to you here in just a second. They go to heaters on your carburetor, and you'll just grab that connector with some pliers and remove it, and then you can finally get enough room to check the clearance on your valves. You'll be aiming for a smaller clearance on this valve, 0.10, so my set has 0.13, 0.10, and 0.08. So you'll want those 3 sizes, or the closest you have to them, and you'll just go through the same process that you did on the exhaust valve on the front cylinder. You're going to go through and make sure that you have 0.1 and that 0.13 does not fit in, and then you'll tighten, adjust, do whatever you need to do, and then triple check before you get it closed. Now we're going to start on the rear cylinder. Before you get started, of course, you're going to make sure your timing mark on the crankshaft and your cam sprocket lines up, and then we'll be able to get access to the valve by removing this hose. So you, in the previous step, removed the fuel pump. There's another hose coming off of your intake as a vacuum feed to the fuel pump that you'll need to remove. And what I did is I took it off of the fuel pump side, and then I was able to tuck that hose out of the way and get enough access for that valve. Before you take that valve cover off, make sure you get all the loose dirt out of the area, then you're free to take both caps off of the rear cylinder. We're going to be aiming for that same clearance as we were with the last valve, that 0.10. So of course I'm going through with my 0.13, my 0.10, making sure that I have a little bit of drag on that 0.10 gauge and no access for the 0.13 gauge. Go ahead and make your proper adjustments, make sure you got your tappet nut nice and tight, and then once you know you have everything set proper, you can go ahead and cover that valve back up.
Now we're ready to adjust the last valve. Before you can gain access, there's a fake exhaust pipe you need to get out of the way. You can see this hose drooping down. There's going to be two 12mm bolts behind there. Once you remove those, you can pivot that pipe, and then you should be able to sort of shake it back and forth and it will get removed. After that, you'll have just barely enough clearance to get your feeler gauge set in. Now, you can see I had to use this sort of right angle setup to get enough clearance to get the measurement. Of course, right now we're going for the 0.12 for an exhaust valve. It's going to be the same measurement we did on the first valve we did. So my set, of course, has the 0.15, the 0.13, and the 0.10. So I'll go through and make sure that my 0.15 does not have clearance between the valve and the tappet, but my 0.13 will have a heavy drag. It's going to be kind of tricky to get your tools in here, but if you take your time and you're patient, make sure you double and triple check everything before you close it up, you should be set. Now that we have our valves adjusted, we can start reassembling the bike. I'm starting here on the right side. I'm going to get the fuel pump reinstalled. We'll start by getting that vacuum feed hose plugged back into the bottom of the fuel pump. And we'll make sure that hose clamp is back in place as well. Then we can get this fuel feed line back in. Make sure you find that hose clamp and set it back in place. Additionally, that wire on your carburetor that goes to your carb heater, you just plug that back in. It should just slide right in place. And then we can reattach the fuel pump using the two 8mm bolts. Next, we reinstall the fake exhaust pipe by the rear cylinder. Just slide the pipe back into the exhaust system and then pivot it up and tighten the two 12mm bolts. Back on the left side of the bike, we need to install the caps on the stator cover. The plastic one you just need snug, the metal one can be a little tighter. Then we'll put the head covers back on the bike with the 8mm bolts. And we'll just slide those back in place, reverse of disassembly. Now we need to reinstall the left side pod. We'll start by getting the pod swung back up into place, and we'll get the little vacuum hose through the hole in the side. This little hose that came off the frame, put that back in place, and you can kind of slide the black box on top of it. Get your check valve lined up. You'll put the two hoses back in. The one on the bottom goes to that box, and then you'll slide it in there. Get your hose clamps in place. Put that vacuum line back on the check valve. Again, double check your hose clamps, and you can slide everything back in place. Again, you've got two Phillips head screws on the bracket and then two 10mm bolts to hold the pod in place. After that, double check everything, and then you can get your cover on. Two Phillips head screws, one on top, one on bottom, and you'll be done. Now we need to reinstall our airbox. Make sure you have it fully assembled and everything's tight. Get those two screws tight. And there's two hoses. There's one on the front and then there's one on the back. The one on the back does not have a hose clamp. You just slide that one back in place. The one on the front should have a hose clamp. Just slide that in place with your fingers, and then you can install the airbox onto the frame with the big hose that goes in between them. It could be a little tricky. Just wiggle it back and forth and it should slide right on. Then you can tighten your two screws, one on the back, one on the bottom, and then make sure the hose clamp to the frame is tight. Now we can reinstall the 12mm bolt for the tank, as well as the seat. Just screw the tank down, put the seat in place, and then two 10mm bolts on each side. Then you can slide your spark plug wires back on the spark plugs, and we're ready to start.
Alright, so I've got everything tightened up. I've got my spark plugs installed. I'm going to give it some choke and start it and make sure it runs right. Let me get the camera close to the valve so you can hear how little noise there is. It was pretty loud before. And that's it. We're all done.
That's how you do a valve adjustment on an XV250. It's a procedure that needs to be done every 6,000 miles or so, which is fairly often. Your first time will take you a good long while, but once you've done it 2 or 3 times, it should only take an afternoon or so. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like or a comment, and as always, ride safe.